You used to be able to walk into a building and disappear for 2 hours and nobody came looking for you. No phone buzzing, no screen glowing, just a book in your lap, a coffee going cold beside you on the carpet, and the smell of paper and roasted beans and the low murmur of 100 other people doing the exact same thing all around you. That place was Borders. There were 1,200 of them, and every single one is gone. Before we dive in, hit subscribe and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. If you ever spent a Saturday afternoon inside one of those stores, you remember what it felt like to walk through those doors, the rush of air conditioning hitting your face, the enormous tables right up front stacked with new releases, glossy covers catching the overhead light, staff pics with little handwritten cards that said things like, "Elena in our poetry section says this one will change your life," and you believed Elena. Because the people who worked at Borders actually read books. They didn't just shelve them, they read them and remembered them. And if you walked up to the counter and said, "I'm looking for something, but I don't remember the title or the author, I just remember the cover was blue, and it was about a woman in France," they'd think for a second and say, "Oh, you mean this one," and walk you right to it. That happened. That actually happened at Borders. Routinely, the aisles went on forever, floor-to-ceiling shelves in every direction, organized by section, and every section felt like its own little world. The travel section with the Lonely Planet guides that made you dream about places you'd never been. The history section where you could lose an entire afternoon reading about ancient Rome, or the Civil War, or some obscure submarine disaster you'd never heard of. The children's section in the back with the tiny chairs and the carpet with letters on it where toddlers sat during Saturday morning story time while their parents wandered off to the magazines. The music section, remember the music section? Rows and rows of CDs in those tall plastic cases organized by genre, and the headphone stations mounted on poles where you could pick up a pair of foam-covered headphones and listen to an entire album before you bought it. You'd stand there with your eyes half closed, nodding your head, and nobody bothered you. Nobody told you to hurry up. Nobody tapped their watch. And the cafe, always the cafe. Seattle's best coffee in most locations, tucked into a corner near the front of the store with little round tables and mismatched chairs and a pastry case with muffins the size of your fist. You'd order a latte and carry it with you through the store like a warm companion, sipping and browsing, browsing and sipping. You could sit at one of those tables for 3 hours with a stack of books you hadn't paid for and nobody said a word. That was the deal. That was the whole, beautiful, impossible, unsustainable deal. Come in, stay as long as you want, read whatever you want, buy something if you feel like it, or don't. We'll be here either way. Friday nights at Borders were something else entirely. Author readings in the event space near the back, rows of folding chairs set up in front of a little podium with a microphone, local writers, big names on tour, poets nobody had heard of reading to 12 people who clapped like it was Madison Square Garden. Book clubs met there on Tuesday evenings, knitting groups on Wednesday, kids' story time Saturday at 10. The store wasn't just selling you things, it was giving you a place to go. A place that wasn't your house and wasn't your office and wasn't a bar, somewhere in between, somewhere warm and quiet where you could be alone in public and nobody expected anything from you except maybe that you loved books. Or at least liked them enough to be in a building full of them on a Wednesday night. The whole thing started with two brothers who just wanted to read for a living. In 1971, Tom and Louis Borders were recent graduates of the University of Michigan, shaggy-haired, idealistic, living in Ann Arbor with no real plan except a vague dream of becoming intellectuals. They thought they would open a small used bookstore, work half-time, and spend the rest of their days reading and writing. They found a second-floor space on South State Street above a leather shop and a guitar studio, 2 tiny rooms and a half bath. They built their own bookcases. They made hot tea every morning and set it out for customers. They put on classical music. The store was so small that if someone needed to use the restroom, tucked behind the service counter, the whole shop had to pause while they did. Their first inventory came from a retired school teacher named Mr. Mills, who sold them his personal collection. They hauled the books up the narrow staircase and arranged them by hand on shelves they had hammered together themselves. No employees, no business plan, barely a business at all. Just 2 brothers in a room full of used books in a college town that already had more bookstores than pizza shops. But something happened. People came, not a lot at first, but enough. Enough to move to a bigger space on William Street, 800 square feet. Then enough to move again, this time to a prime spot at 316 South State, the former home of Wars University Bookstore, a name that had been on that corner since 1892. 3 times the space, a full basement, an office upstairs. And a man named Joe Gable became the soul of the place. People assumed Gable was one of the Borders brothers. He was not. He was a man who believed a bookstore could be a cathedral, and the people who worked in it were its congregation. He treated every shelf like an altar and every recommendation like a sermon. When Borders hired new staff, they made them take a test, an actual written test about books. If you could not pass it, you could not work there. That was the standard from the very beginning. The real magic, though, came from Louis. He was the quieter of the 2 brothers, the math brain. Somewhere in the mid-70s, Louis built a software system that could track which books were selling, in what quantities, during which seasons, and in which regions. He identified 55 distinct seasonal buying patterns and programmed them into the system so the store could predict what customers would want before they even walked through the door. Publishers called it the envy of the industry. No other bookstore in America had anything like it. Borders had the highest sales per square foot of any bookstore in the country, and much of that was because of a system built by a hippie math student in Ann Arbor who just wanted to make sure the right books were on the right shelves at the right time. By 1985, the brothers opened their first superstore prototype. Bigger, broader, books and music under one roof. The concept caught fire. By 1992, they had 21 large stores, and the company was valued at nearly $200 million. That same year, Kmart came calling. The retail giant had bought the mall-based chain Walden Books back in 1984 and was struggling to make it work. Over 1,200 Walden bookstores were in every state in America, and none of them were thriving. Kmart figured the Borders brothers could fix the whole operation. Tom and Louis sold their 20-year dream. They stayed on as investors, but the bookstore they had built with tea and classical music and a test you had to pass was now part of a corporate empire. 3 years later, Kmart spun off both chains as a new company called Borders Group Incorporated, listed on the New York Stock Exchange. Revenue at the time of the IPO was already $1.5 billion, and the expansion was just getting started. Between 1995 and 2003, Borders opened stores at a pace that made the rest of the industry dizzy. 52 new superstores in a single year. By 2003, there were 1,249 locations combined across Borders superstores, Walden Books, and Borders Express outlets scattered across every corner of the country. Revenue climbed toward $4 billion, 35,000 employees. The stock peaked at nearly $45 a share. Jim Collins put the company in his famous book, Good to Great, as one of the best performing businesses in America over a 30-year stretch. Borders was not just a bookstore anymore. It was a cultural institution. The kind of place where a first date could turn into a marriage, where a lonely teenager could find a world bigger than the one outside the window, where a retired teacher could spend every single morning in the same chair in the same corner reading the same newspaper and nobody once asked her to leave. And then piece by piece, it all started to slip away. The first crack was invisible at the time. In 2001, Borders made a decision that would later be studied in business schools as one of the most self-destructive moves in retail history. They outsourced their entire online bookstore to Amazon. The whole thing. If you went to Borders.com, you were redirected straight to Amazon. Amazon handled the orders, the shipping, the customer service, and most importantly, the customer data. Every person who typed Borders.com into their browser became an Amazon customer. Borders essentially handed its future to the one company that was building the machine to replace it, and they did it willingly. Their annual report that year said the online investment would be channeled to support the in-store platform. They believed the internet was a side project, a convenience channel, something to check a box. They believed the real business would always happen inside the store. They were wrong, and it took them 7 years to even realize it. They did not launch their own website until 2008. By then, Amazon had become the largest bookseller on earth, and half of it was built on the customers Borders had gift-wrapped and delivered. The second crack was the e-reader. Amazon launched the Kindle in 2007. Barnes & Noble launched the Nook in 2009. Apple launched the iPad in 2010. Borders launched the Kobo in 2010. Too late. Years too late. And even then, they did not own the technology. They were outsourcing again. They partnered with a third-party device maker instead of building something of their own. The company that had once invented the most sophisticated inventory software in the book business could not manage to put its name on a reading device that people wanted to hold. The third crack was the music. In the mid-2000s, Borders was still pouring money into compact discs and DVDs. $600 million in annual music and video sales, nearly $1 in $5 the company made. They expanded those sections, added more shelf space, and bet heavily on physical media at the exact moment the world was going digital. iTunes launched, Netflix pivoted to streaming, file-sharing networks spread across every college campus in the country. The revenue from physical media did not decline. It vanished. And Borders was left with acres of retail space filled with products nobody wanted anymore. The fourth crack was the stores themselves. Sales per square foot had peaked all the way back in 1997 at $261. But Borders kept opening new locations for another full decade after that peak. A decade of expansion while the numbers were falling. They signed 15-year and 20-year leases on buildings the size of half a football field in high-rent areas with declining foot traffic. When the company finally admitted in its bankruptcy filing that the expansion strategy had been a mistake, it read like a confession written 10 years too late. And then the leadership carousel. 7 CEOs in 13 years, each one arriving with a new strategy, a new vision, a new plan to save the company, each one leaving before the plan had time to work or fail. Robert D. Romualdo, Philip Pfeffer, Greg Josefovich, George Jones, who was fired, Ron Marshall, who resigned to become Chief Executive Officer of A&P, which also went bankrupt, Bennett LeBeau, Mike Edwards, the last one standing when the music finally stopped. There was no steady hand, no long view, no one who stayed long enough to understand what Borders was supposed to be. Losses piled up. $157 million in 2007, $187 million in 2008. The stock fell from $45 to $5 to $1 to 25 cents. Holiday sales plunged nearly 15%. 200 Walden Books locations shuttered. Corporate staff in Ann Arbor were cut from thousands to a few hundred. The building that had once hummed with the energy of one of America's greatest retail stories was emptying out floor by floor. In February 2011, Borders filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. They closed 228 stores immediately. They hoped to reorganize, slim down, and emerge smaller but alive. Mike Edwards spent months in New York courting investors, begging for a lifeline. The deal was 90% done. He believed it. Everyone at headquarters believed it. And then at 5 o'clock on the evening before the court hearing, the phone rang. The deal had collapsed. The investors had walked away. There was nothing left to reorganize. Edwards had to fly back to Ann Arbor and file for liquidation instead. 399 stores, 10,700 employees, 40 years of bookselling gone. When Edwards walked through the doors of Borders headquarters that day, he did not know what to expect. But what he found was every employee still in the building, hundreds of them, standing in the hallways and the conference rooms and the lobby, and when they saw him, they applauded. For 20 minutes, they stood there and clapped for the man who had tried to save the place where they had spent the best years of their careers. Not because he had succeeded, because he had fought. By September 2011, the last Borders store turned off its lights. Barnes & Noble bought the trademark and the customer list for $13.9 million. The brand that had once been worth billions, that had employed 35,000 people, that had operated in every state in the Union, that had been the second largest bookstore chain in America, sold for less than the cost of a single Manhattan apartment. What stays with you isn't the numbers. It isn't the bankruptcy filing or the stock price or the 7 CEOs. What stays with you is the feeling. The carpet under your knees in the history section at 10 o'clock on a Thursday night when the store was almost empty and you had the whole aisle to yourself. The sound of someone turning a page 2 rows over. The hiss of the espresso machine. The way the light caught the gold lettering on a hardcover spine and made it glow for half a second as you pulled it off the shelf. The staff-picked cards in Elena's handwriting. The teenager in the music section with her eyes closed, headphones on, nodding along to something you'd never heard. You remember bringing your kids there for the first time. Watching their eyes go wide at the children's section, so many books in so many colors, they didn't know where to start. You remember your daughter pulling a picture book off the lowest shelf and carrying it to the tiny chair and sitting down and not moving for 45 minutes. You remember thinking you should probably go, but she was so happy and the coffee was still warm and there was nowhere else in the world you needed to be. Tom and Louis Borders never imagined any of this. 2 rooms above a leather shop in Ann Arbor, hot tea in the morning, classical music on the speakers, a bathroom behind the counter that shut the whole place down, a test you had to pass to work there, a brother who wrote software that could predict what America wanted to read before America knew it wanted to read it. All of it born from the simple, quiet, impossibly naive belief that if you fill a room with the right books and the right people, the world will find its way to your door. One of the last employees to leave the Ann Arbor headquarters said something that stuck with everyone who heard it. He said Borders put an awful lot of books into people's homes, and those books are still there, on nightstands, on shelves, in boxes, in the attic that nobody's opened in years, and tucked inside some of them, between the pages, is a Borders bookmark or a crumpled Borders receipt from 2004. And someday someone is going to find one, maybe your grandchild, maybe a stranger at a yard sale. They'll hold it up and read the name printed across the top, and they'll ask, "What was Borders?" And you'll take a breath. And you won't know where to start. If you ever lost yourself in a bookstore on a rainy afternoon, if you ever read the first 3 chapters standing up in an aisle and bought the book because you could not stand not knowing what happened next, if you ever sat in a Borders cafe with someone you loved and talked about nothing and everything and the coffee went cold and neither of you cared, tell me about it. Drop your story in the comments. I read every single one.